Productions.
So I just wanna talk about this thing that's in my brain. It keeps me from wanting to go on, but I want some gain. Maybe a little fame. Yeah, oh yeah.
Hey everybody, just want to hop out in front of this episode 1 second and give a huge shout out to our first sponsor, Vincent Shriglia. My boy's been here from the beginning and just so happens to be our number one sponsor for the show. Thank you so much, and a little call out to you guys once we get up to, hopefully we can get to 5 sponsors, and when we do, you guys will be getting a special episode for yourselves. So thank you so much, and let's keep it rolling. Send this out to your friends, send this out to people you love, people that you think will like it. See where this thing can go. Thank you again. Enjoy the episode.
Everybody, welcome back to the We the Patriots podcast. We got Sal Asante here and a good friend of mine, John, Coach John.
How you doing, man? It's good to be here.
Oh, it's awesome to have you, man. I really enjoyed my time on your podcast, and there's no way in hell that I could let it go without having you on mine.
Yes, so that was a great episode of It's Not So Black and White. We covered a lot of ground on that episode.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we rolled through quite a few topics, tried to keep it focused on opioids and cancel culture, and there's no way it stayed to just that.
Just wasn't going to happen, but here we can explore whatever we want.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of my my plan for today, is because we have so much crap going on in America, like I was saying before, that so I was kind of hoping that we could do this show on self-improvement when I first booked it, but I think we're gonna try to stay super general just because of everything. But for everybody listening, this is my friend John from Canada, and kind of wanted to see, kind of let you expose yourself, how you even got into this podcasting thing. So how did you, how did you start your business, your health fitness? How did your journey start with that?
Well, why don't I'll give you the backstory in a bit of a nutshell here. So I've had about a dozen careers. I've been a Marine engineer in the Navy, a nanotechnology researcher, a globetrotting nomad, an English teacher, power line technician, heavy equipment operator in the oil field, a supplement store owner, and now a nutrition coach and a mentor to coaches who are starting up their coaching businesses. So that's a lot of things that I've covered. About 11 years ago, I went through a traumatic experience and dealt with PTSD and sort of the mental health fallout that comes from that.
Right.
About 8 years of kind of like mental health hell. It wasn't super fun, but it was kind of going through that and going through everything that I struggled with and looking for answers and not finding them that led me to doing what I do now. And so it's really, I would say nutrition is almost like the cover story. So the way that we interact with food is kind of indicative of our relationship with ourselves and the way that we use food for everything other than nourishing our bodies. So,
right.
That's in a very condensed nutshell, a big story.
A huge story. And yeah, if you go onto Coach John's website here, you will see quite a transformation in body type.
Yes,
it is quite impressive, I must say.
Well, thank you. It was a lot of work.
I can imagine. So did a lot of that weight pack on while you were going through that mental health
absolutely.
period? Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. So I was using food to medicate. So I didn't turn to alcohol or drugs, but I did turn, and it wasn't even really a conscious decision, but it becomes a habitual behavior. The way I would describe it is like, I feel bad, I eat food, I feel better temporarily.
Right. It doesn't last too long.
It doesn't last very long. Yeah. Shame, guilt, and regret usually follow a binge. And so, after that, it's like, it's a game of sort of like chasing the feelings and living in denial as well, which is a really interesting.
That's interesting because that's the same feeling that most people are getting from their drugs, from their alcohol.
Yeah.
You're just getting it from food.
Yeah, basically. I mean, food addiction is it's debated in terms of whether or not it's actually a clinical diagnosis, but what is known is that we can eat certain foods and they light up the reward centers in our brain. Very similarly to the way that drugs like cocaine or methamphetamine would. It's not obviously it's not quite as powerful. Like cocaine boosts dopamine like 2,500% in your brain, like it skyrockets it, right? But interestingly, we're not exactly rats, but rat studies point to a couple things. The rat that was given a choice between cocaine and sugar went back to sugar more often than cocaine.
Really?
And
that actually blows my mind.
So it could be argued that that sugar is, is more addictive than cocaine.
Wow.
And it's probably true. because I mean, I think with a rat, there's no sort of social issues, but I think with human beings, it's probably considered more acceptable to use sugar than cocaine. I don't know. Depends on which circles you travel in.
I guess depends on how far it gets, right?
Like if you're a keto cocaine user, I guess using sugar is like a major sin, but I don't know how many keto cocaine users I know. So if there are any in my life, just let me know.
That's awesome. So when you were, I guess we can kind of at least focus a little bit on self-improvement. When you were bringing yourself out of that, how did you find the motivation? What turned you around from that bad habit lifestyle that you were living?
And motivation is a funny one because it's I for a long time I wanted to point to motivation and discipline as like the reason that I sort of succeeded, but ultimately like it's not true. And I think, and why I highlight that is because we sort of set ourselves up for failure if we start to if we sort of base our success around the ability to be motivated, because it's not really how our brains work. So motivation is nice to have. It's a bonus. It comes and goes. But if we buy into this idea that I have to have motivation before I can take action, more often than not, we're not going to take action. But what's really interesting is motivation follows action. So there's something about, like, usually it's pain, right? So for me, it was pain. I was tired of being so overweight. I was desperate. Like, and I tried so many different ways to lose weight, so many diets. I had a supplement store. I had like an entire pharmacy of supplements at my disposal and couldn't seem to lose the weight. And I was even feeling kind of hopeless about it. I was like, how can I know all of this stuff and still am unable to successfully lose weight? And so, and believe me, there were certainly times where I was really motivated, but I could never sustain it. I think that's why I'm picking on motivation a bit, is because if we think the initial motivation we feel is going to sustain an entire transformation, we're fooling ourselves and setting ourselves up for disappointment.
Because you're going to fall at some point.
You will. There's a quote that I came across not that long ago. It goes something like, relapse is as natural to change as exhaling is to breathing. In other words, so because we look at it from like, I'm really fascinated by neurology and the brain. So if we look at it from a brain-based perspective, when we're trying to create change, what we're trying to do is build a new skill set, really. And it takes time and repetition to build a skill set. And along the way, if we get tired, if we get stressed, if we get burnt out, whatever, we're going to revert back to old patterns of behavior that require less effort and less conscious thought to do. Now, if we have the story, though, that somehow this is a character failing, I'm a flawed person because I couldn't seem to maintain 100% willpower 100% of the time. It's like, well, no human being can.
Yeah, I think you're setting yourself up for failure at that point. Right.
And that's this all or nothing type thinking. So to bring it back to motivation, it's like, well, motivation follows action. There's something about when we are taking steps to better our health, even if we're not where we want to be, it feels a lot better than when we know, or at least for me, when I knew that I was just living sort of kind of destructively. I tried to gloss over.
So getting the ball rolling is more important than the actual motivation itself.
And really, like, working with your brain the way that your brain works. So our brains don't work in the way that we're like constantly motivated, but it does work, in terms of forming patterns of behavior that don't require conscious thought. So, I mean, James Clear popularized this with Atomic Habits, and there's been a few other books since then.
Right.
But it's just this idea that a behavior that gets repeated doesn't require as much effort or conscious thought. We don't rise to the level of aspirations, but we fall to the level of our habits and our systems. So the way that we support ourselves in daily life.
And that's why we kind of practice sports so much. That it's a perfect example, in my opinion. So why do you put so much time and effort when nobody's watching? It's because when it's on the line, you revert back to your training.
Same in the military, right? You drill and drill and drill over and over and over again, so that when you're and you drill in hard circumstances, so that when you're confronted with when the bullets are actually flying, you don't. That's your default behavior. You don't revert to panic and running away. You go, this is what we've trained for. So we do this without thinking. I mean, the point of, like, you think about military, the point of it is to get you to do things without thinking about it, to follow commands without pausing to think. So.
No, it makes perfect sense. That, for whatever reason in my mind, this carries me into wanting to talk about what's been going on in the U.S. in the negative light. These bad actions that continue to come up in the news light, most of them being like horrendous mass shootings or horrific acts of violence. It seems to me like we've had a pattern of bad behavior put forth in front of our eyes as just Americans or just consumers of media.
Right.
And it
Yeah.
seems like a cycle that we're not really able to break out of. And if anything, almost, I don't want to say necessarily that it's getting worse, because I think that they try to blow up numbers and stuff. You really look at it year over year, the numbers do go up and down, but it's not going away, right? There's nothing really getting better with it. Do you see that as being quite a problem?
But yeah, but it's so interesting, because I think about it, it's like what we put our attention on is the thing that gets, like, like a horrific shooting of school children is going to be burned into everybody's consciousness. Like, I'm a father, and the thought of somebody just murdering my child, like, it's almost unfathomable, the stuff that runs through my head when I think about that, for everything from rage to despair. And so anyone who's a parent, that is burned into your brain. But what gets missed is, like, there's probably been 10 times as many murders in the south side of Chicago, for example.
Yeah. And that's, I kind of wanted to bring that into light as well, because it turns into a political thing where it's right, left, where it seems like nobody's actually paying attention to the actual issue at hand here, which is that people are dying en masse.
Yeah. Like, it's these incidents, these mass shooting incidences, they draw the most attention. And
absolutely,
that's a bit problematic in and of itself, because if you got a megalomaniac with an AR-15, this is what they're going to do, because it's going to get the most attention.
Right.
And so there's an element of that as well. And so, I mean, I'm Canadian, and we have different rules and laws around our guns. I look at it like this, like, I don't necessarily think AR-15 should be pulled off the market, but, like, your legal drinking age in the US is 21. Why? Because you don't make very good decisions when you're, a teenager. Exactly. So why can an 18-year-old buy an AR-15?
Right.
Now, we could argue that, well, okay, if he can't buy it, he get someone to buy it for him. We do the same thing with alcohol when we were kids. You get someone to bootleg it for you, we called it. And it's true, to some degree. But I think most people can be like, kid, why the heck do you want me to buy you an AR-15?
Most rational people. Yep.
There's a temptation to want to pin it on mental health too. But I think, well, other countries have as many mental health crises as, per capita, probably, as happens in the US. Right. But they don't have as readily available access to guns,
to firearms.
So it's, like in Canada, I have to get a license that's renewed every 2 years. I have to have certain qualifications in order to purchase ammo, and there's a lot of restrictions on what we, in fact, I think they're even trying to put a ban on handguns in Canada.
Oh yeah. I just saw Trudeau coming up and saying that in front of the whole country.
Yeah. Like, this is getting stupid. I'm like, because I recognize that there is an argument to be made for the ability to defend yourself, because, hey, like, now we don't have as many shootings in Canada, right? We don't.
Just straight up, it's a fact. Yes.
Yeah. And we could argue that it's a cultural thing as well. We don't grow up glorifying guns and violence and things like that. Like, we just don't. Like, it's so. Is there an element of that? Maybe first-person shooter games could be. I mean, but there's so much money in first-person shooter games. Any story that comes out that suggests, because I'm inclined to think that what we see in media does desensitize people.
Yes.
Right? So why would we think that hours upon hours of playing video games shooting people wouldn't desensitize you to it?
I completely agree.
We recognize that, just to take a slight left turn here, like, pornography desensitizes the brain.
Oh, yes.
Right. So what it does, because I would think the predominant consumers are males, well, what it does is it teaches males to dehumanize females.
Yep. Or whichever person that they plan on having sex with.
Right. Yeah. I'm going with sort of majority of behavior at this point in time. Right. But yes, I agree. We can span many different behaviors. But so if we know that that's the case, like, why do we think that seeing violence in movies and playing violent video games doesn't desensitize us to the reality of it?
I completely agree. And look at, like, Fortnite. You turn it into a cartoon. Your outreach to children becomes almost your primary target.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, there's like rabbit holes. You go like, is there 100%. Some conspiracies here? Is there, like, some people sort of being hypnotized? Well, I don't think hypnotized and mind control is like that's maybe a little bit of a stretch, but it's more like, okay, if you have 100 million teenagers, I don't know if there's that many in the US, but let's just say for numbers. So you got 100
I would
million
say you got to be
teenagers.
close. Yeah.
Sure. There's probably more like 60 or 70.
I would say,
anyways.
I would say somewhere around 50 to 70 million would be probably a good guess.
Mm-hmm. And let's just say 25% of them play violent video games. That's probably a conservative
Fair estimate.
Sure. So we're talking anywhere from 12 to 15 to 20 million playing violent video games. So you go, statistically speaking, yeah, okay, the majority of kids don't have, but out of those numbers, eventually you're going to get somebody,
even if it's just 0.01%.
Right. So it's almost, in one sense, it's almost a numbers game. So I mean, I can understand some of the arguments for. I mean, I think there should be slightly stricter restrictions on firearms. I mean, but then you had that Oklahoma shooting. Was that like today or yesterday or something?
Yeah. So we had one in Oklahoma, and then there was one in Texas, and then, like I'm running out because they happen so often, apparently. Right.
Right. And where a guy literally went and just bought an AR-15 and knocked off 4 people at a medical clinic because he was in pain from a back surgery or something like that.
Yep.
That
you didn't get his recurring treatment or whatnot. Yeah, I didn't read into the whole story. It was just disgusting.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, this is why you could argue that maybe, like, okay, maybe let's switch over and say alcohol. So in Europe, they have a different culture on alcohol.
100%. Yep. Most of them can start drinking around 16, I believe.
Yep. And, kids may even get, and I don't think it's the best idea, but kids can have like sips of their parents' wine or whatever. But there's a different culture around it where they don't see alcohol as a way of just getting absolutely smashed off their face and, partying wildly. It's not really treated like that. I lived over in Italy and Poland and whatnot. And yes, there are people over there that do get drunk, but it's generally regarded like it's looked down upon, generally speaking, as a society. They treat it, they teach you how to drink alcohol responsibly
from a younger age too.
Yep. So why can't we do this with guns? If you want a gun, you have to go through like this course here,
training or something,
some kind of training. You have to go through maybe a psychological assessment. I'm not entirely opposed to that. I mean, I think sociopaths can probably manipulate their way through it, but why not put people through we put people through a driver's assessment to drive a vehicle.
Right.
So it's like, it's not saying I'm going to take all your guns away, but it's saying, hey, you know what? Maybe we put some restrictions on the access to it. And yes, of course, we can argue that, hey, speed limits, there's still people who break them. Yeah, there are, but there's probably less because speed limits exist.
Exactly. I think that leads it into a good conversation too. And one that I was having with my father today was that just growing up, it was really strange because in my school, or I guess multiple schools, because it happened in middle school and high school, but we received bomb threats, shooting threats. And it was I would say there was almost one every other month. At some point, there was definitely one every month. And when it gets to that point, it kind of goes back to your desensitization point in a different way, where it's like, we're not even going to treat this as real almost. And, what if, God forbid, this is the one time that it is?
Right. It's almost like the cry wolf scenario.
That's exactly what it's like.
Well, I mean, I graduated in 2000, and I think Columbine happened in 1999. Is that correct?
I believe.
And right. And that was probably the first major mass shooting or mass killing.
The first one that was at least publicized.
Right. And so, I mean, I just want to say, like, I'm grateful I got out of high school before this was a thing, really. So we go, why is it in the last 20 years in particular, this has taken off? Because I believe there's been pretty easy access to guns for, I don't know, centuries in the US.
I mean, the access to guns before Columbine was so much easier. I think actually maybe not necessarily Columbine. 9/11 was probably the point where it started getting a little tougher. But otherwise, the access to guns in America has always been relatively easy, especially compared to the rest of the world.
Right. So we could look at that and we go, okay, that's a thing. Why then is school shootings now a thing when it wasn't before? And I think we could look at social media, self-centeredness. Like I hate to throw out the N-word, the narcissism, because I think sometimes it gets thrown around. I wonder what people thought when I said N-word, but anyways, I think narcissism gets thrown around by people who don't have an understanding of the clinical diagnosis. But I think every one of us has some narcissistic elements to our nature, and this feeds into that. I will get notoriety if I do this. I can this desire to achieve some kind of media, like, because remember, the US also runs like a 24/7 news cycle that people are hooked into, like news junkies are hooked into, right?
Absolutely.
So there's so many things outside of just like easy access to guns that are the problem. Like we've got like a mental health crisis with kids. We've got glorification of violence like, you know, never before. You think, because you look, I don't know if you ever watched any movies from like, I don't know, the 60s or 70s, like before your time, before my time.
At some point,
You know,
I have.
Sure. And it almost looks goofy, you know, so you
Yes.
just know it's fake. And so there's a part of you that just kind of knows, okay, this isn't real. You look at it now and the realism that's in these movies is shocking.
Yeah.
Right. Again, the realism in the video games is shocking. And again, the idea that like I can just kill someone and they come back, except in real life, this doesn't work like that. And
Yeah.
so maybe you combine social media, mass media, media coverage, self-centeredness, mental health crisis, easy access to guns, probably, you know, health issues, like maybe kids aren't getting, you know, nourished properly. And so because of that, that's also adding to sort of the mental health crises. Like you add all these different factors together and you realize, okay, it's not quite so simple as saying, well, we just cut off your access to guns.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because what happens when you make guns illegal in the United States? If it was to happen, they're still floating around. So who's going to have them? Only law-breaking people would have them at that point.
Because a gun is a force multiplier, right? So somebody comes into your house with a gun. What do?
Hopefully you have a gun to match.
Right. You know, because there are examples of people who carry, like, I think there was a woman that shot some guy who started, you know, popping off rounds. She whipped out a handgun and 4 to the chest or something like that. I mean, so she was trained in how to use a firearm properly, safely managed to neutralize the shooter as, you know, in other words, she killed him. You know, I forget where that one was. Was that Oklahoma too? Seems like
it may have been. I know that there was also that massive shooting in Texas a few years back that I think the guy did end up killing like 20 plus people, but he was stopped by someone with an AR. It was in a church.
Okay. Yeah. And so the hard part is like, how do you determine who's the good guy and who's the bad guy here? You know, and it's funny because people go, oh, wow, like we just didn't see this coming, like never gave any indication. I mean, I think rarely is there like zero indication that was taking place. It's
almost
that
never.
Yeah. We're afraid because hindsight is 20/20 every time. Like, oh, he liked, I don't know, beating up on animals or bullying kids or whatever, or, you know,
has a disgusting Facebook feed. Like, that's a common one.
Right. So there usually are some clues. But I think it's also, again, the question of, okay, how far do you go in saying, hey, you look like you could be a shooter, so we're going to surveil you a little bit more. So, like, again, the liberty, I guess we could say the liberty versus security argument as well.
Absolutely. And yeah, so like I think kind of like you just laid out, you have so many different layers to this issue that it's hard to come up with a viable solution. And I think that's why we're in gridlock. You know, you're just yelling at each other from different sides, thinking that maybe one solution is the end all be all. And, you know, in my opinion, you just start, you know, you don't see them implementing a lot of their solutions because they're kind of wild out of left field. But you just assume that if they were to implement some of the things they're talking about, it just wouldn't solve the problem.
Right. I mean, yeah, trying to ban guns altogether, I think is not a great idea, because there is that whole issue of like, you look at countries around the world where rights to firearms were taken away, and you can see how sort of there can be a slide into, you know, tyrannical governance.
Absolutely.
Even in Canada, it sounds probably like overly strong language to suggest this, and maybe guns can't solve this, really, truthfully. But you know, we had like a really peaceful protest last summer. Was it already that long ago? Anyway, the trucker protest.
I was going to say the trucker protest.
Yeah, it wasn't last summer. It was last winter.
Yeah, it was going in. I think it was going into this year.
Yeah, and it was like the largest like peaceful protest in Canadian history. You know, they tried to send a few provocateurs into there to snap a few photos, but people on they couldn't keep up with social media showing all of the positive stuff that was taking place. That you know, they were doing things like, again, but what our government did is then it just started like depersoning people. Like, hey, we're freezing access to your bank account, you know, we're cutting off your driver's license, your passport, everything else. We're literally just going to freeze you out of society. And guns don't solve that problem. Right?
No, they don't. Well, I guess it depends, because if enough of those people got their accounts frozen and they really did turn into non-peaceful protesters, you know, that might change the mind of the government. That being said, it's a numbers game almost, and I couldn't see enough Canadians pulling up arms.
I mean, I live in Alberta, which is kind of known as the Texas of Canada. And like, I'm not a firearm owner. I mean, I'm an ex-military, so I was trained in the use of firearms, but As of yet, I haven't really seen a great need for me to own one. Maybe things will change if society keeps sort of going a more and more violent direction. I have plenty of friends with guns, but yeah, I think we're in an uphill battle where guns can't solve all the problems either. Like I think your president made some suggestion like, hey, we have F-16s and nukes or something like that. It's like, oh boy, that's a good one to say, isn't that?
Yeah, well, I think that's actually a really good segue too, because a lot of media coverage lately has been kind of showing indications that there's a lot of just unhappy people that are willing to take up arms even against their political rivals. And when you have this, and then like you said, you have a president suggesting, well, yeah, go ahead and come after the military. We have nukes and tanks. That's what makes people more scared.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like you're willing to use it.
Yeah. On your own population.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in general, I would never want to see nukes used, period.
I completely agree. And on this World War III front, it looks like threats are being hurled left and right.
Yeah.
And well, makes the populace scared, regardless of who the threat's coming from.
I mean, frankly, if we want to take a left turn again into sort of Russia-Ukraine crisis,
go for it.
Which is there's a lot more than meets the eye. I'd lived in Eastern Europe as well, and I'll say that Ukraine is like one of the most racist and corrupt and like mafia-run countries ever. It was already a failed state, and the destruction that has been happening over there prior to like Russia stepping in. It's almost like Russia is conducting if this was the U.S. stepping in, you'd call this a peacekeeping mission.
I think you can make the argument for that.
Right. That's the irony of this is you could call this a peacekeeping mission, except it's Russia. And we've been conditioned that like Russia's eternally the bad guy.
Right.
And I'm not saying I agree with like Russia's actions, but I'm saying, hang on a sec. I think we need to take a step back and maybe we need to reflect on like sort of our own behavior and what led to this. I mean, right now the Ukraine military is using cluster bombs on its own civilian population where there isn't Russians.
Yep.
Do you hear the media talking about that? No. Why?
You don't hear it anywhere because, well, that wouldn't really support the Ukrainian message.
Right. And so you have problems like this that are taking place as well. So, I mean, but what stops like NATO theoretically from a military standpoint to crush Russia, right?
Oh, well, it's retaliation. You know that when you start this battle that there's a good possibility that China, Iran, India is getting into the mix at that point.
Well, that's just it, right? Because if it was like Russia and say, for example, Russia and the US going head to head, US wins every time at this point in time. But Russia has an equalizer. That's why they have nuclear weapons. And this is why so many countries want to have nuclear weapons because it's an equalizer. It's a force multiplier. You go, I mean, Russia's defense budget is smaller than Canada's probably. Like really?
I would assume it's massively, massively less.
Right. So this idea that like Russia is a military power, yeah, it's sort of, they have numbers.
If you look at them, maybe just based in maybe Eurasia, Eastern Europe. Yes.
Sure. But I would say that like, say Russia's actions are not entirely unjustified, put it that way, because the situation is a lot more messy than people would be led to believe. But I think the point of steering over in this direction was to say, that Russia is uttering threats around nuclear weapons, but basically the point is that they're just saying this to stop, a larger military from moving in. And it's now just a proxy war being fought in Ukraine, the same way the proxy war was fought in Vietnam, a proxy war was fought in Korea. This is a proxy war is what it is.
Yeah. And, it definitely riles up the populations and stuff like that. But I think a good point that you made with Ukraine is just the corruption that was existing prior to any of this. And it was one of my, I guess, favorite things to do some research on. I heard a lot of information from, I'm sure Glenn Beck.
Heard of him, yeah.
So Glenn Beck is a conservative, used to be a Fox News show host, and then he moved on to his own things. But he did, I think it was in 2016, 2018, maybe, he did a massive series on the corruption in Ukraine. And so many ties go back to actual US politicians, one of them being our president right now.
Yeah.
Funneling cash, funneling people over there to try to fix the corruption when you're ending up actually basically asking for more of it.
Well, it's been used as like a money laundering state,
Absolutely.
essentially, right? So we send foreign aid over there and we get kickbacks. So now our money's clean,
Mhm.
clean. Yeah. That's, and this is the part that sort of surprises me if we almost bring it back to the US media, is how many people like are turning a blind
I was
eye to
going to
this.
say, going like this.
Yeah, turning a blind eye to this because, and we can ask, okay, why do people do this? And I think if we were to actually just be confronted with the reality of how evil and corrupt our own politicians are, I mean, we've been conditioned to think that they're righteous and they say all the right things, and there's a lot of cynicism towards politicians in every political stripe, of course, but we a part of us wants to believe it to be true, like the good guys, and to learn that, oh shoot, we're like as corrupt and awful as the next. I mean, how many of your politicians are on both sides of the aisle are basically warmongers who have probably own shares in all your big military industrial complex companies? When there's a conflict like this, like, people are just going to dump a bunch of let's dump all our old crappy weapons into Ukraine to use them up, and then we have let's get people to do that, so now they have to buy new stuff from us.
Exactly.
And war is making people a lot of money. I mean, ironically, it's making Russia a lot of money when the price of oil goes up too, right? So, but it's so, and I think about the numbers. Like, if we could just, if the population could pull its head out of its butt, essentially, and actually go, hang on a sec, like all of us common people here, like we're all in this together, regardless of your political stripe. And we end up getting sort of conditioned to fight over all of these stupid things, all of these scarce resources, while all of these people who have obscene amounts of wealth, just do whatever they can to encourage infighting amongst each other.
I completely agree. I mean, look at how much attention this the Johnny Depp trial got, right?
Yeah. I'm proud to say I have not watched a single second of this stupid trial.
That took away so many Americans' attention from what the real issues are going on, right?
Inflation.
Well, inflation's the biggest one, but the war in Ukraine's another one. And obviously this mass shooting stuff is starting to come up now, which is another thing to just focus on, I guess, for the media. But people in America seem to really sway their attention quite easily. And I think that the media takes advantage of that all the time. Yeah.
The media has always been a propaganda arm. Like in Canada, we have
it's
the
kind
CBC.
of like in their name, even though it's not supposed to be.
Yeah. Well, we have the CBC, or the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and that's our state broadcaster, essentially. Well, they were founded by the Liberal Party of Canada in about 1936 or something. So they were literally founded as
long-standing.
As a propaganda arm for that political party. And so historically speaking, the Liberal Party, which would be similar to, I think somewhat similar to your Democrats, I guess, has probably been the party that's had the most number of years in power.
Right.
Whereas I suppose the Conservatives would be closer to the Republican side of the aisle. It's not exactly the same thing in Canada. And we have a few other, but all of us to say that because we have this propaganda arm, that for one political party, well, they're the ones that tend to be in the public consciousness the most and get the most favorable stories. And if I understand correctly, is it your former press secretary is with a news outlet, and your current press secretary is in a relationship with someone from a news outlet?
They all are.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. They all are. They all have connections. They all know what talking points that they want to spoon feed. A lot of them are handed to them by news outlets. And it's pretty obvious if you're paying enough attention, and that's why I stopped paying attention to politics as much as I can.
Yeah, it's like I don't actually watch a lot of news, and because I'm going to hear about it. Someone's going to talk about it somewhere, somehow, and I'm going to hear about it if it's a big enough deal. But yeah, it's. I mean, I think almost no news outlet can really truly be trusted, except for maybe independent journalists. They're trying to do something good to a degree. And lots of independent journalists have been former news company reporters who said, I can't stand this sort of corruption and spin, so I'm just going to try and take my audience to follow me and go independent. And so there is this sort of fractionating of attention. That's not to say that they're independent of spin either, but at least I think they can more openly acknowledge their bias.
I was going to say the biggest thing for independent sources is that they usually acknowledge that they have a bias leaning whichever way before they actually get to their story. And
right.
To me, as just a rational thinking human being, or at least I like to call myself one, it makes you feel a little bit better going into that cycle, whatever story they're playing on, that they actually have an understanding from a certain point of view, and they're willing to tell you that, so that you can at least get from their perspective, or at least put yourself in the mindset, rather than being lied to by a giant corporation that's saying that they're in the middle.
Right. Well, you think, who pays the bills for the news media? It's advertisers. So
and who's the biggest advertiser in America?
Pfizer.
Basically, I was just going to say pharmaceuticals, but yes, anything leading in that direction. But yes, Pfizer is by far and away.
Right. By a long shot. And again, we wonder why are people so angry when the average person's like skeptical? It's amazing the level of division that was again created around the recent pandemic and whatnot, when it's like the corruption is staring you in the face, but you've been conditioned to be so afraid that, and this is not me saying the pandemic wasn't real. I don't want anybody to misunderstand my words, but there's a difference between
this is the right podcast to be saying that, but it's okay.
Right. Well, I'm just thinking about, words can get twisted.
Oh, of course.
Whatnot. But why do we have people getting so angry at other ordinary people who are like, can you not see the corruption staring you in the face? You have a revolving door between Pfizer and your FDA. Can we just acknowledge that is like massive, massive conflict of interest and corruption?
Absolutely.
That 25% of the revenue is coming from one pharmaceutical product, a vaccine that really hasn't even at the time of recording this yet, concluded its clinical trials, and has been shown like from a long-term efficacy standpoint is atrocious. Like everybody I know who's been, double and triple jabbed has gotten COVID and got hammered really hard. It's just been like 4 to 6 months after vaccination or beyond where it loses its effectiveness altogether.
Have you been vaccinated yourself?
No.
That's a good call. I'm impressed that you're able to even survive in Canada by doing so.
Well, it's because I work from home.
Lucky.
Yeah, because I run my own business and I work from home. And my wife was on mat leave for the majority of the pandemic. And so for us, we have pretty generous mat leave in Canada. I will say there's one benefit to having sort of a socialist leaning country is like she got 18 months of mat leave, which I mean, from a family health standpoint, is pretty incredible.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah.
Right.
When you're looking at it from a standpoint of just creating a connection between parents and children, that's something that's just not granted in the United States. I think you have like a maximum of like 3 months most of the time,
which is insane. It's insane. And this would almost bring us right back to, we think about sort of the social and mental health issues we see in the US. We could look at like fatherlessness and like parent, like I call it forced parent absenteeism. In other words, in order to survive, they have to work sometimes 2 and 3 jobs and so on. I
was going to mention that. Yeah. So you're almost forced, especially with the cost of everything now, you're almost forced to become a two income household, no matter what your status is.
Yep. And so what we have is we have children like at 3 months old, like my little kid was barely getting to know me, like as his dad, let alone, and I just can't imagine at 3 months, like having to hand him off. Like, so I consider ourselves like really fortunate, really privileged that like my wife was able to stay home for this long. And, now he's a little more independent. He's running around, he's yabbering away. Like he's a ton of fun, but, and he can be apart from us, but just from that standpoint of like the baby developing a bond to mother, like that is so crucial to the development of the emotional health of the child. And so maybe we could point a finger and say, this is the lag time from like years of policies that kind of destroyed maybe investment in family. And we look at other countries who have invested in generous mat leave benefits and they've reaped tremendous like social benefits from that. They have a more stable society because children are connected to their parents.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point to be made. And because even just looking outside of that, just fatherlessness, how much that plays a role, especially in young males developing properly.
Right. Yeah. So the destruction of like I say destruction, and I'm not suggesting it's entirely deliberate, although I don't know that it's entirely accidental either, frankly. Because if you look at it from, again, the dynamic of like those who have power want to remain in power, and the way that you remain in power is you divide the population against each other so they're not staring at you and what you're doing, because a united population could actually
Turn
do
around,
something.
point fingers, and start to take you down.
Take over certain things where, eventually it descends into like civil war, like you have in Ukraine, but it's like there's something about kids being connected to their parents, and males having fathers in their life. And if you what's the common thread amongst almost every mass shooter in the US?
I was just going to say they're all male.
They're all male, but how many of them had a strong father figure in their life? Like a strong positive father figure?
Yeah, you generally speaking, they're almost zero.
Right. So you want to say, okay, here we've identified like one of the biggest problems, and yet you look at like sort of, how hard it is like to be a dad in a sense. Now, I've watched my wife go through pregnancy and childbirth and nursing and raising my son. I think motherhood is just the most beautiful and noble thing. I just have like a world of admiration for mothers and what they go through.
Absolutely.
I think we should actually have a Mother's Month, frankly, given again the time of the recording and the month that we're going into. Again, I don't want to offend anybody.
No, but who we're celebrating, and it's not just this month.
Yeah. It's like, who are we celebrating? Why are we not celebrating mothers? And why not just like celebrating them? Why are we not making it easier for mothers to care for their children? This is what brings a stable, prosperous society. But then on the other hand, look at what an important role it is for especially males, boys growing up, that they have a strong father figure in their life. It's just like my son's going to grow up knowing me, as far as long as nothing unforeseen happens. He's going to grow up knowing me and knowing a strong male figure who loves him, and he's going to develop healthy, emotionally, or we're going to give him the best shot at that. Put it this way. We're going to give him the best shot at developing in a healthy, emotional way, knowing that he's growing up in a stable, relationship. My wife and I, when we got married, we said, this is it for life. We're just going to figure it out whenever it gets tough. We're not quitting. We're going to figure this out. And we stuck to it for, we're at 17 years. So.
Right. And you're on a good path to keep it going. But yeah, I think that's just a fantastic point, Nate, though, because we're, as Americans, you look at it like, I don't even know if it's just America, but just the divorce rate in general, the amount of couples that end up splitting, you end up trying to split time. And then most divorce courts are giving custody to the female, or most of the custody to the female. And I think it may play a larger role in the males without having a father. Yes. But I do think it does not really matter too much when you have a child who is, brought up. Maybe a lot of times they're brought up, your father caused this divorce, your father, right? Because they're so removed from their father. When you have a bad image of what a male could be, you that this is the toxicity, right? When in reality, all human beings are flawed. Yeah. I think you even mentioned it at one point in this show. If you don't acknowledge that at the forefront when you're talking about parents or your co-parent, right? It seems like you're leading a child down a path of just not trusting males, maybe not trusting themselves if they are a male. Maybe they don't trust their own instincts. They'd rather tend towards the feminine side because that's what's been getting them through. And a huge issue for me in America is that you have, I think teachers tend to be like 80% or more female growing up. It's tough when you're a young male and almost, if not all of your education and upbringing is by a female, because most likely your father's away at work. Your only parent is at the house a lot of the times is a female. And then you're going to school and being taught by primarily females. You're not really getting a great male perspective most of the time. Right.
Yeah. That's an interesting way of putting it, like young men not trusting in their masculinity. Because I think it was Bill Maher who pointed this out. I don't know what side of the aisle he leans, but anyways.
He's quite liberal.
Okay. I've only seen a couple of clips of his, but he seems to at least he seems to have a degree of common sense.
No, he's a common sense liberal, I think would be a good way of putting it.
Yeah. Well, he pointed out that, you go back a couple of generations and less than 1% of the population identified, and I guess for lack of knowledge of all the letters, I'm going to say the alphabet community. No disrespect intended. I just don't know all the letters.
LGBTQ plus. That's the last
Probably.
one I remember.
Yeah,
it's changed. But
there's probably 17 more added onto there. But
Mhm.
What he was pointing out was like, you go back 3 generations, 2 generations, 1 generation, you're seeing less than 2% of the population, and all of a sudden we have a generation where 20% of the population are identifying as being a part of this community.
Absolutely.
And you go, what's happening here?
What's the change? Yeah. What
what's
happened?
the change? Right. And this isn't a knock on anybody who's genuinely a part of that community, but is it a fad? Is it people that are confused? Is it indoctrination of children who are totally, absolutely messing them up? Again, we point to this where, I ran a physical business in my city that was a designated safe space where anybody from that community could come into my store and they would be safe there.
Mhm.
We had yoga that was exclusively for that community to make sure that they were, again, cared for. So I had plenty of interactions in that community. I have friends who were part of that community. And still, it's like you ask any of them, like off the record, what their biggest struggle is, and it's going to be their mental health.
Right.
And it's not coming from bullying or lack of acceptance or anything like that. It's actually coming from a very unstable sense of identity, or
Right.
unstable
The sense of
identity.
self. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're making a huge mistake when we're saying to people, you can be anything you want to be, whatever you can imagine in your head, we can make that happen in real life. And I'm like, do we even know the health ramifications, the long-term health ramifications of mutilating and chemically altering our children?
Mhm.
I don't think so.
Well, there's no way. There's never been a published study, to my knowledge, that says that this stuff is good. Most of these procedures and treatment of children is relatively new. If you're looking back, like I don't even remember any of it really as a kid growing up, but I did have like a little bit of an anecdote from high school. So we had, my age group had a few transgender people, and one of them ended up being in my health class. And in that health class, that person was given an opportunity to step up in front of the whole classroom and basically teach the classroom about the community, LGBT community, and more specifically the transgender community. And I just, as myself in my way in bringing up, I just stepped out of the classroom. I need to go to the bathroom, and I just walked out, and I didn't come back till the end of class. But the whole class sat there and, I don't want to say ate it up, but sat there and listened to it. And it really threw me off in my own space that this was just so widely accepted. There was no pushback. Like, I wasn't going to get up in front of the class and say, no, I don't agree with this. I didn't want to start a fight.
Because you're going to get the mob after you, who is the self-righteous mob.
Right. But there's no voice at this point. That's the counter. It's all supportive for this community. And it's not just this alphabet community. Like you said, it's any really just sect of people that like to call themselves a community that's not really white males. If you can create a community that's anything but that, it seems like in today's age, it's going to be supported and promoted. And like you said, anything you want to be, you can be. It's never really looked at as a reality thing.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a lot of harm being done to impressionable young minds, but I don't see it being reversed. Here's why. Let's look at the pronoun thing. How many people do you see now that put pronouns after their name? They don't need to, because it's like the standard is, if you're not a part of that community, you're just going to be a him or a her. Like, that's it. But it's a virtue signal, right? It's a way of saying, I am a good person. Now,
support this, even though I may not be inside of it.
Right. And what's going to happen is that's people are being indoctrinated in this sort of form of self-righteousness that feels really good. And then it's continuing to be pushed and promoted. You righteous, good person for doing this. And it's like, well, I don't have to put my pronouns in front of my name in order to be a good human being and treat people with kindness and compassion.
Absolutely.
But the problem that I have, again, is this is, I think, really actually harming our children. And I'm sure it's safe to say in this
completely
podcast,
agree.
but I'm like, man, I can just see this getting pulled out of context. You can see in my brain, or you can hear in my brain or my voice, like, I'm like, shoot, do I self-censor here because of the pushback I could get from having a genuine concern for the health and well-being of human beings and of children?
And isn't that bizarre that you need to be in a point where you're self-censoring yourself rather than just speaking? I'm sure for a fact if we are off camera,
my truth.
if we are not on camera, we're just talking, shooting it,
Yeah. Shooting the breeze.
I'm hearing a different John. I'm hearing, and it's not because at this point I don't really self-censor myself at all. I try to just speak whatever's on my mind, but it's bizarre to me that because you don't hold this, I guess what seems to be majority,
it would appear that
even though I don't believe that, I genuinely don't believe that this is the majority feeling in the United States or even in the world, but people are just so afraid.
Yeah. Well, and here's why. I run an online business, so I still largely depend on social media as one of the ways. And what can happen is, even though they might be a minority of people, they can be extremely vocal and extremely vicious because
they're the most active on social media.
Right. Because so it's very easy to get labeled and then get attacked and get swarmed and get buried for simply voicing concerns. I'm suggesting that when we start chemically altering children's bodies, like, again, we don't let someone drink alcohol until they're 21, ideally. Why? Because we recognize it's harmful. To go in and suggest that, hey, well, we're going to give you, and they use such flowery language like gender affirming surgery. What? Like, I didn't know what the heck I wanted to be, but like, imagine if my parents, started doing, like, I don't know, gender affirming surgery when I'm like 6 years old or 8 years old because, it's safer to do it now than later. Well, hang on a sec. If I, and it's, again, people will say this is a straw man argument or a bit of an absurd example, but it's like, if I'd have said, well, I want to be a Tonka truck when I'm a kid, so I want you to dye my skin yellow and tattoo Tonka on my back, and I'm going to wear, a dump truck backpack, and I'm going to identify as a dump truck,
I tell you why I don't see that as a bizarre example. The reason being is you are just taking the context of gender and throwing that out the window. Right. All you're doing is making the same exact story, just about not gender. And I think that was the absolute main point of, you ever hear of I'm sure you've heard of the Daily Wire.
Yeah. Is that Ben Shapiro?
Ben Shapiro. So he has another host on his, I wouldn't consider it his. Daily Wire has another podcast host named Matt Walsh. And Matt Walsh wrote a book called Johnny the Walrus.
Okay.
And
you can see where this is going already.
Okay. It is exactly your point with the Tonka truck. And it is actually a children's book. So I highly recommend it to you if you wanted to possibly just expose your kids to these ideas at a young age. It's a picture book. It's not meant to be super, intellectual or anything, but it's just a real representation of what the gender reaffirming surgery, what the hormone blockers, just taking it away from gender. When you see that the point is not gender, it sounds bizarre. It sounds completely unfathomable and insane. Yes.
Right. Well, what I don't understand is, so like I work in the realm of behavioral psychology. My background is marketing psychology, but I like to say that I use my powers for good in the work that I do now. And what I don't understand is, why would we not choose the least harmful intervention when we're dealing with children? So if somebody is confused about who they are, well, why wouldn't we clarify that confusion and say, well, actually, this is who you are, but now this is seen as like harm and violence. Oh, you're harming children. You're violent, inflicting violence upon them. I'm like, what?
Just because you're not affirming their beliefs?
Right. Because we live in this such a self-absorbed world where it's like anything I want to be, I can be. But I think there's an attraction to this as well, because you get perpetual victim status.
Oh yeah.
Right.
That's a huge point.
Right. And so it's like, I will get to be a special person who gets a special month of celebration and special status and special treatment. Now, look, I understand that there are people who were legitimately a part of this community who, through the centuries and even through the last century, who were oppressed. They were mistreated cruelly and unkindly. They were not shown compassion. They were jailed and so on and so forth. Okay. I agree that those steps weren't right. But there's another side of it where I also don't agree with indoctrinating children and confusing impressionable brains. I mean, the Catholic Church knew this. They said, give us a child until 7 and we'll show you the man. What they were saying is you let us indoctrinate the child until they're 7 years old and we will have a Catholic for life.
Absolutely.
Right. So if we can indoctrinate these children before they turn 7, that they can pick and choose their gender, which they can't, and then, this just brings up so there's this idea of sort of leftist logic, and I don't really identify as someone on the right, which is funny to use this language. I don't identify as this. I feel like I identify as a politically homeless individual here who's trying to find common sense in a world that's seemingly going insane. How about that? Right. I'm still grappling and wrestling with all of these issues here, but it seems like the far left is much more insidiously harmful. Like the far right is harmful in terms of maybe they're a threat of direct violence right now.
It's more of like a threat right up front, where the leftist threat seems to be hiding in the fog.
Yeah, it's like, see, I think both of your political parties are wildly corrupt, insanely corrupt.
I would completely agree.
Beyond redemption corrupt kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But what you have is like the Republicans, at least they don't entirely try to hide it. Like they pretend a little bit, but they're pro big business, right?
Yeah, it's hard to hide it when you just have such an obvious plan of attack, right?
Right.
And I think when you're talking about the leftist agenda in America, is that, to me, it seems like you so badly want to commit to a communist or a socialist way of life, but you just don't want to admit it because you know how sour it's going to taste to Americans. Mm-hmm. So they, like I said before, you hide it in the fog.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting thing, because I would say that like I'm a bit of a social capitalist. I mean, I already talked about the benefits of like having extended mat leave here in Canada.
Right.
Now that being said, like we pay into that system, right? So it's not like but it's like everybody pays into it and someone benefits from it, at any given time.
That's a tangible thing that you can actually say this is helping. Like it's harder to make that case when you're talking about like generalized welfare, when you're talking about food stamps, when you're talking about programs set up that seemingly just set the hook for somebody to be on the government check the rest of their life.
Right. Just to create a type of modern day slavery.
A mat leave actually has a reason where you're saying, yes, we are pulling this money away. It is taxed income that we are putting into, so we're going to allow women to stay with their children. But there's a clear benefit. The clear benefit is that you're going to have that family connection that otherwise would not be available.
Right. You're going to create a strong, healthy society when you create strong, healthy family bonds. So, so this sort of leftist way of thinking seems like more insidious because they're hypocrites. They lie to your face and believe their own lies.
That's the bigger issue to me. It's not necessarily that they're lying to your face, because like you said earlier, each one of them is lying, but they believe their own lies.
Yeah. That's the part that's like seems like the most disconcerting. Like you take what's his face, that red-haired comedian,
Carrot Top.
No, I was thinking the long-haired guy, JP Sears.
Oh, JP Sears, yes.
Yeah, that guy. Yeah, you can tell I know a lot about celebrity culture. But I think he made a video just recently, actually, about like leftist logic, and he made this flow chart. And I guess he was just highlighting the holes in all of their arguments, right? We could look at something like abortion, for example, and go the abortion debate. Well, frankly, I believe that abortion is murder. Now,
wow, I'm actually impressed to hear that from a Canadian.
Yeah, I believe it's murder. I was born at 26 weeks. So theoretically, I could have been.
You would have been aborted under the right circumstances.
Right. I could have been put to death. Yet here I am, and whole and complete, without too many mental deficiencies, I don't think. I
hope not.
Yeah. So, but at 26 weeks, I'm whole and complete and alive here, 40 years old. I wasn't expected to live back then, but somehow.
But now already know. I hope I know what you're going to say. But what's the leftist argument? My body, my choice.
Right.
You're not talking about the same body that we're really arguing over. When you're not acknowledging that there's another separate human being inside of you, when you're just talking about it as a part of you, that's where you can get away with making this, I think, upfront lie.
Yeah, it's again, it's insane to me. And the crazy part is I think the founder of like Planned Parenthood was a eugenicist, a racist
A
eugenicist.
racist eugenicist who was planning to keep minority populations down.
Right. So let's set up all the Planned Parenthood clinics in the minority neighborhoods and kill off all their babies.
And look at what's happening now. Yes, there's a high abortion rate all across all, I guess, just women in general.
Demographics. Sure.
But the highest rates are among Black women.
Yeah. Yeah. It's again, so if you look at maybe the percentage of the population that is Black people versus other minority groups who are growing in America,
We're growing. That's exactly where I was hoping you were going with that.
Right there, but the Black population isn't, because a lot of the other sort of minorities, they especially those of say Latin American type descent, there's a whole supply of population from like the southern tip of South America all the way up who could potentially come up, work their way up to Mexico and cross the border and so on.
Yeah, sure, but once they get here, most of them are planning to have families, and not necessarily small ones either.
Right. Yeah. Which is funny because they're often Catholic, and against abortion.
Right.
But it's like abortion is just a cruel thing. So here's the argument that gets held up, and that is, well, what about the 11-year-old that gets raped? Okay, that's an incredibly difficult case that I would have a hard time adjudicating.
Why are you making a policy decision based on a one-off?
Right. So, but I could say we could put certain maybe exception clauses in there, like the mother that's going to die.
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. But why does it have to be abortion? Why can't we try to deliver the baby?
Yeah. It's if the mother's going to die.
I understand when there is no
Sure.
other option, but
what we're, but that's exactly what I'm saying is I am willing to make certain exceptions where it's like the guaranteed death of the mom,
Right.
where there isn't another option, or it's the most horrific circumstance imaginable. But what happens is those get held up as like, this is the reason I'm fighting for him. Like, dummy. That's not true.
That's not
true. Why don't you talk
because
about what like 98% of abortions are
abortions?
Inconvenience ones?
Exactly. Coming from Hillary Clinton's mouth maybe 20 years ago, it was supposed to be safe, legal, and rare. That's thrown out the window.
Now it's celebrated amongst young people.
Celebrated, and it's used, unfortunately, it is used as one of the primary forms of birth control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if I get pregnant, I'll just that way I don't have to use any contraception. If I get pregnant, I'll just get it sucked out. Like the
and paid for by the taxpayer.
The language that gets used is just horrifically inhuman. And so so it's like, okay, well, what stance do I take here? Well, am I going to fight you if you're determined to murder your baby? No, I'm not, because you're going to find, if you're so determined, you're going to find a way one way or another. But the thing is, you cannot convince me that abortion is not murder.
And I'm in the same boat.
So that's, I will not put a gun to your head and say you can't do this, because I'd literally be going against my own stance when it comes to murder.
Right. But you're not going to change my mind. Right.
You're not going to change my position on this, because in I don't know how many states I could have legally just been put to death or murdered as a baby.
Yeah, at this point, most, except for like Texas, maybe Arkansas. There's a few that are
Sure.
just limiting it to the point of like 6 weeks.
Yeah, and so that's the issue here. And I'm sure there are people on the right who distort the issue and take policies and distort them and twist them and things like that. That happens too, and it's kind of a shame if that happens, because whenever you start distorting things for political on either side of the aisle, you're undermining your credibility and giving the other
when
side
you already have a winning issue.
Right. Like, but just straight up, abortion is murder in my eyes, and you can't really convince me otherwise. Like, when you are putting to death another human being against their will, that's murder.
Right. And their opinion was never taken into account. You're making this solely based on your own personal status, your current situation. It's very sad, and it's extremely sad to me that it's looked at as a negative when you want to incentivize, more importantly to me, incentivize possibly adoption, other forms of not having this responsibility. And you get looked at as, well, you're not carrying that baby. Right. Yeah, sure. To me, that's not the argument to be made.
Yeah. And people say, well, they call themselves pro-choice, but it's like, okay, I'm pro-adoption. pro giving birth, like pro, the contraception, abstinence. Like there's certain choices. And so
I'm just not pro-abortion.
Right. I'm not pro-abortion. I'm pro the other choices where the human being gets to live. That's really what it boils down to.
Exactly.
But we've been brainwashed again by using language that desensitizes people to it.
Yeah.
That dehumanizes the little life that's growing in there, and ask anyone who's had a miscarriage who tried desperately to get pregnant, like what it was like to lose that little life.
Right.
It's
like they lost a child that was alive and well.
So when we have, in a sense, brainwashed an entire generation that this is women's reproductive rights.
It's not just with abortion though. It's with so many different, just different topics, different claims. And it kind of goes to George Orwell's 1984 doublespeak, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you're the right loves to use that book at this point, but he was I don't know if he was a socialist. He was a democratic socialist. He claimed George
very
Orwell.
prescient though what he wrote.
Right. And you just look at today's society after reading a book like that, and you can't help but just see so many similarities, and it scares the crap out of you if you're thinking rationally that this stuff is happening, like you said, to all of our children, but not just that. It's continuing into just media in general.
Well, I think actually you could marry A Brave New World with 1984.
Love that book.
Right. Those two together, because it's not so much that like there's a gun being held to our head, but we're being brought into captivity through hedonism as well, more so. And so I think the two of them together would probably be more accurate depiction of society as you know it. But again, I hate to sound like really cynical, but I don't really see this turning around, at least not in North American society. But what's really interesting is it's not working on other countries. And I think the US is kind of tearing itself apart from the inside. It's annihilating itself from the inside. So
I ask you to close this out. I think that our only way of really pulling ourselves out of this is to continue to talk, continue to do what me and you are doing. And as I say I mean everybody. I hope that everybody tries to join in the conversation. Let your thoughts be heard, even if you think it's controversial. And would you have another idea on that? Because to me, like you said, I don't see a way of turning things around, really, especially if you're talking policy wise. I don't think that 1, 2, 3, even 15 different policies, or just removing old policies, I don't think it solves a problem at all.
Yeah. No, we need to bring topics into the public square and just discuss them, and not hate on people for a position that necessarily hold, but understand that, hey, you know what? Like, let's understand how you got to this place where you hold this as your opinion. I don't claim to have the right answer on everything, but from where I stand right now, from what I have from my experience, these are the beliefs that I hold. And if you want to challenge them, then feel free to challenge them. But it's like, ultimately, this comes from a place of compassion and appreciation for human life.
Right. I completely agree. And so I call out all of my listeners and your listeners as well, hopefully, to do what you guys can in your own personal life to stand up for the things that you actually believe in. Don't let your inner voice, that self-censorship, stop you from, exposing your views to the world.
Yeah.
And other than that, my friends, I hope you guys have a great week. It was awesome having you, John.
It's been a pleasure.
Definitely be talking again soon, my friend.
I'ma make all these bitches say, damn, I wish I were the fucking state. I wanna be something, not nothing. Trapped inside my dream and I'm running away from these demons. But the feeling's so good, I'ma keep dreaming.